The window was unlocked. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was the blood. It was early morning, the sun barely touching the edge of the Oklahoma sky, when a mother walked down a hallway she had walked down 1,000 times before. She was doing what mothers do. Checking on her children. Making sure the world was still in its right place. She reached her daughter's bedroom door, turned the handle the way she always did, and pushed it open expecting to see two little girls still wrapped in the heavy sleep of childhood. But only one child was in that bed. The other was gone. She stood there in the doorway, the silence pressing in around her, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. A moment ago the world was ordinary. A moment ago it was just a Tuesday morning. And now her daughter's best friend was not in the bed where she had been the night before, and the window on the far side of the room was sitting slightly open, and there was something dark and wrong on the windowsill that she could not yet bring herself to name. She crossed the room. She looked at the window. And then she looked down at the grass below. A child's torn underwear lay in the yard, soaked through with blood, glistening in the pale morning light. Whatever she had hoped for in that instant, whatever small desperate corner of her mind was still reaching for an innocent explanation, it collapsed right there. Because there was no innocent explanation for this. There was no version of this that was okay. There was only the truth that the window was unlocked, the sill was stained, the grass below told a story of violence, and a little girl named Kirsten Hatfield, 8 years old, small enough to still believe the world was safe, was gone. Just like that. Gone. And somewhere in that same quiet neighborhood, just 2 doors down from where this mother was now standing with her hands shaking and her voice breaking open into a scream that the whole street would hear, the person responsible was already moving through his morning like nothing had happened. Like a child had not been taken from a window in the night. Like 18 years of freedom were already beginning to unspool before him. He had no idea that the evidence he left behind would one day speak for itself. He had no idea that science would catch up to him. He had no idea that 18 years later, a single detective's refusal to give up would unravel everything. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we get to the ending of this story, you need to understand everything that came before it. Every year of silence. Every year of grief. Every year that a family lived without answers while a killer lived without consequences. You need to feel the weight of what it means for evidence to sit in a storage room untested for nearly 2 decades while a little girl's mother grows older and the case file grows dusty and the world keeps turning as though nothing happened. You need to understand all of it. Because Kirsten Hatfield deserves more than a headline. She deserves the full truth. And tonight, on Coldcase Crimelab, that is exactly what we are going to give her. Welcome. I am your host. And this is one of the cases that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Let's begin. Before we go any further into this story, if you are new to Coldcase Crimelab, right now is the moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. We are a channel built on one belief, that cold cases don't have to stay cold forever. We go deep into the evidence, the forensics, the investigation, and the human stories behind some of the most haunting unsolved and solved cases in history. Every single week, we bring you the full picture. Not a summary. Not a surface-level retelling. The full picture. So if that is the kind of content you have been looking for, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. Turn on the bell. And let's get into it. To truly understand what happened to Kirsten Hatfield, you have to go back to the beginning. Not just the night she disappeared. You have to go back to the place. To the time. To the world that she lived in, because context matters in a case like this. The setting matters. The neighborhood matters. The ordinary, unremarkable, completely average quality of that night matters, because it is the ordinariness of it that makes everything that followed so devastating. Midwest City, Oklahoma. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors. Where children ride their bikes to school, where families sit on front porches in the summer heat, where the houses are close enough together that you can hear your neighbor's television through the window on a quiet night. It is not the kind of place where you imagine something like this could happen. But of course, that is always the thing about cases like this. They never happen in the places you imagine. They happen in the places that feel the safest. They happen in the houses where the doors are unlocked and the children sleep without fear and the parents close their eyes at night trusting that the world will hold still until morning. Midwest City, Oklahoma. 1990. Kirsten Hatfield was 8 years old. 8 years old. Think about that for a moment. Think about what 8 years old looks like. Think about the world through the eyes of an 8-year-old, the way everything is still large and full of possibility. The way a sleepover feels like an adventure. The way the summer stretches out in front of you like it will never end. Kirsten was right there in the middle of all of that. A child in the fullest, most complete sense of the word. A little girl with her whole life in front of her, spending the night at a friend's house, sleeping in a room that felt safe because rooms always feel safe when you are 8 years old and you do not yet know what the world is capable of. The two girls had gone to sleep that night the way children do, probably talking too long, probably giggling past the point when they were supposed to be quiet, probably drifting off slowly with the kind of deep, heavy sleep that only children can manage. The kind of sleep where the world disappears completely and nothing gets through. And that night, something happened that should never have been able to happen. Someone came to that window. We do not know exactly what time it was. The darkness of a summer night in Oklahoma can be complete, the kind of thick, warm dark that makes everything feel a little unreal. At some point in those quiet hours between midnight and morning, a presence arrived at that window. Whether Kirsten woke up. Whether she heard something. Whether she was taken by force or lured by someone she may have recognized, these are questions that the investigation would wrestle with, questions that would haunt everyone connected to this case for years. What we know is what the evidence showed. The window was unlocked. That window, that single unlocked window in a bedroom where two little girls were sleeping, was the point of entry. Or exit. The point of crossing over from the world as it was to the world as it would become. The blood on the windowsill told its own story. A story of struggle, or of injury. A story of something violent and wrong happening right there in that small space between the inside of the house and the outside world. And down in the grass below, that torn, blood-stained underwear. The other child slept through it. Or did not wake up in time. Or was so deep in the grip of childhood sleep that she simply did not register whatever sounds there may have been. When morning came and she opened her eyes and looked across the room, the bed beside her was empty, and she would have had no way of knowing yet what that emptiness meant. But when Kirsten's mother came down that hallway and opened that door and looked at the empty bed and the open window and the blood on the sill, she knew. She knew in the way that only mothers can know things. In the way that bypasses logic and reason and goes straight to the deepest part of the body where the truth lives. She knew before she crossed the room. She knew before she looked at the grass below. She knew before she screamed. Kirsten was gone. And the morning that had started like every other morning in Midwest City, Oklahoma would end with police tape and investigators and a community holding its breath around a question that had no good answer. Where is Kirsten Hatfield? Law enforcement arrived at the scene with the urgency that the situation demanded. An 8-year-old child missing under violent circumstances is not a slow response situation. This was immediate, all hands, every resource available. Officers secured the scene. They documented the window, the sill, the blood-stained area outside. They collected the torn underwear from the grass. They photographed everything, bagged everything, logged everything with the careful methodical attention that crime scene investigation requires. On paper, the scene was processed properly. Evidence was collected. The biological material, the blood, the traces left on that windowsill and on that clothing, was logged and stored. It existed. It was real. It was preserved. The problem was what happened next. Or more accurately, what did not happen next. Because in 1990, DNA analysis as we understand it today was in its absolute infancy. The technology existed in early forms. DNA had famously been used for the first time in a criminal conviction just a few years earlier in England, but it was expensive, time-consuming, and far from routine. Local law enforcement departments were not equipped with the resources or the expertise to process genetic evidence the way we take for granted today. The infrastructure simply wasn't there. So the evidence was collected. And the evidence was stored. And investigators pursued the case through the traditional means available to them: interviews, canvassing the neighborhood, building a picture of who might have had access to that house, who might have known the family, who might have had a reason to be near that window in the middle of the night. But the leads did not produce an arrest. The weeks became months. The months became a year. The case grew colder in the way that cases do when the initial surge of investigative energy has nowhere new to go and the answers simply refuse to come. Kirsten was never found. Not her. Not her body. Nothing. She vanished as completely as if she had simply ceased to exist. And for her family, for her mother especially, that absence was its own particular kind of torment. Because grief with no body is grief with no ending point. There is no funeral that closes a chapter. There is no grave to sit beside. There is only the not knowing. The perpetual, grinding, relentless not knowing. The possibility, however small and however unlikely, that somewhere in the world your child is still alive, held somewhere, unreachable, and you have no way to get to her. That is a specific kind of suffering that very few people understand who have not lived it. And Kirsten's mother lived it. Every single day. While the case sat in storage. While the evidence sat in storage. While the neighborhood went on being a neighborhood, and the children on that street grew up and moved away, and new families moved in, and the house where it happened got repainted or renovated or simply settled into a different version of itself. And while all of that was happening, while all of that ordinary life was moving through time the way ordinary life does, the man who had gone to that window in the night was living 2 doors down. 2 doors down. Going about his days. Working, presumably. Sleeping, certainly. Walking past that house. Living in the same physical space where he had committed an act of unimaginable violence against a child. And doing so, this is the part that is almost impossible to wrap your mind around, for 18 years. 18 years. That is how long the case remained unsolved. That is how long it took before a detective sat down with the file, looked at what had been collected from that scene, and asked the question that should have been asked years earlier. Has this evidence ever actually been tested? The answer, when it came, was no. And that answer, that single devastating no, was the moment that everything began to change. Now, before we get into what happened next, I want to take a moment to talk about something that is central to understanding this case. Because one of the questions people always ask when they hear a story like this is, how? How does evidence sit untested for nearly 2 decades? How does a case stay cold that long when the answers were there all along? And the honest answer to that question is complicated and uncomfortable and worth exploring, because it helps us understand not just what happened in this specific case, but what happens in cold cases across the country. When Kirsten Hatfield disappeared in 1990, the science of DNA analysis was at a very different place than it is today. The first criminal case in the United States to use DNA evidence had occurred just 3 years earlier, in 1987. At that point, DNA analysis was still largely the domain of a small number of specialized laboratories. The cost was extraordinary. The process was slow. The reliability was being established case by case through legal challenges and scientific debate. It was not something that a mid-size Oklahoma law enforcement department could simply run through their standard evidence processing pipeline, because that pipeline did not yet exist. In the years that followed, the science advanced rapidly. Through the 1990s, DNA analysis became more reliable, faster, and less expensive. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was launched by the FBI in 1998, creating a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes that law enforcement agencies across the country could access. This was a revolutionary development. It meant that biological evidence from a crime scene could be processed and compared against a national database of known profiles, potentially matching an unknown suspect to a name even without an existing lead. The implications for cold cases were enormous. Think about what Cody's meant for cases like Kirsten's. It meant that biological evidence collected years or decades earlier, evidence that had sat untested because the technology wasn't ready or the resources weren't there, could now be processed and potentially matched to a profile in the national database. Old cases, frozen in time, could suddenly be cracked open. Evidence that had gone nowhere could finally speak. But here is the thing about Cody's, and about the potential of DNA technology to solve cold cases. The potential only becomes reality if someone actually takes the evidence off the shelf and sends it to a lab. That is the step that matters. That is the human step. The decision to go back. The decision to pull the file, look at what's there, ask whether it has been fully analyzed, and if the answer is no, do something about it. That step requires resources. It requires time. It requires funding for laboratory analysis, which even as the technology advanced still had associated costs that cash-strapped law enforcement agencies had to weigh against their other priorities. It requires someone to decide that a case that has been cold for years or decades is still worth spending that time and that money on. And it requires, perhaps most of all, someone who cares enough to try. In the case of Kirsten Hatfield, that someone took a long time to arrive. But eventually, they did. At some point in the years after Cody's was established and DNA technology had become routine, a detective turned their attention to Kirsten's case. We can imagine what that looks like, sitting down with a file that has grown thick with the weight of years, reading through the original reports, looking at the evidence log, noting what had been collected from that bedroom window and that patch of grass on that morning in 1990. The biological evidence was still there. Properly stored. Preserved. Waiting. The detective sent it to the lab. The lab processed it. And the result came back with a name. A name that belonged to a man who had lived 2 doors down from the Hatfield family. A name that belonged to a man who had been right there, in plain sight, for 18 years. The moment a DNA match comes back in a case like this, the moment a name appears where for years there has been only a blank, there is no single way to describe what that feels like. For the investigators, it is the end of a long road and the beginning of a new one. For the family, it is the answer to a question they have carried so long it has become part of them. But it is also, in many cases, the opening of new wounds, because the answer does not always bring the healing that people hope it will. In this case, the name that came back from the lab was a neighbor. A man who had lived just 2 houses away from the family that Kirsten was visiting that night. 2 houses. Let that settle in for a moment. Because the geography of this crime is one of the things that makes it so deeply disturbing. This was not someone who came from a distance. This was not a stranger who passed through Midwest City and was never seen again. This was someone embedded in the community. Someone who had perhaps seen Kirsten before. Someone who knew the neighborhood, knew the houses, knew the layout of the street well enough to approach that window in the dark. Someone who, after committing an act of violence against a child, went home. Went home to his house 2 doors down. And stayed there. And went on staying there. For 18 years. While investigations were conducted and eventually stalled. While the neighborhood processed a tragedy and gradually moved on in the way that communities eventually must. While Kirsten's mother kept living with the question. While the file sat in storage and the evidence sat in storage and the answer sat in storage, waiting. When detectives went to arrest the man whose DNA had come back as a match, he was not some shadowy figure who had gone underground. He had not fled. He had not reinvented himself in some distant city. He was right there. Still in the same area. Still living his life. Still, apparently, confident that the weight of what he had done would never find its way back to him. He was wrong. The arrest was made. The evidence was undeniable. The science was clear. DNA does not equivocate. DNA does not get confused or forgetful. It does not lose track of the years or allow itself to be persuaded by a good story or a sympathetic presentation. It simply is what it is. And in this case, what it was proof. Proof that the biological material left at that scene, on that window, on that clothing in the grass, matched the DNA of the man who had lived 2 doors down. The case that had gone cold 1990 finally, after 18 years, had a resolution. Not a complete resolution. Because Kirsten was never found. And that absence, the fact that her family never got to bring her home, never got to lay her to rest in a way that would allow them to say goodbye, is something that no conviction, however deserved, can ever fully address. The forensic science worked. The system, eventually, delivered an answer. But the answer could not give them Kirsten. And that is the reality of so many cold cases that we cover here on Coldcase Crimelab. The resolution is real. The justice is real. And the grief, the permanent, structural grief of a family that lost a child, is also real. These things coexist. They always have to coexist. Because the justice system can tell you who did it. Science can prove that they did it. But nothing, no verdict, no sentence, no confession, can fill the specific shape of the absence that a child leaves behind. Now I want to talk about what this case means in the larger context of cold case investigation and DNA technology, because that context matters and it adds something essential to our understanding of what happened here. The Kirsten Hatfield case is not unique in its broad strokes. What I mean by that is, the story of evidence sitting untested in storage while a case goes cold is not an anomaly. It is not a rare exception to an otherwise smooth-running system. It is, unfortunately, a pattern that has repeated itself across the country in hundreds of cases, particularly cases that occurred in the 1980s and 1990s, before DNA analysis became standard practice. There is actually a term for this issue. Untested rape kits. Untested forensic evidence. The backlog. These words come up again and again in conversations about cold case investigation, and they point to a systemic problem that extends far beyond any individual case or any individual failure. For years, for decades, law enforcement agencies across the United States collected biological evidence from crime scenes and from victims, logged that evidence properly, stored it correctly, and then never processed it. Not because they were negligent in the traditional sense. In many cases, it was simply a matter of resources and technology. Labs were backed up. Funding was limited. Cases were prioritized based on factors that, in hindsight, sometimes left the most vulnerable victims without the analysis they deserved. The reckoning with this backlog has been ongoing for years. Advocacy organizations, journalists, legislators, and law enforcement reformers have worked to draw attention to the scope of the problem and to push for the resources needed to address it. Cold case units have been established in departments across the country specifically to revisit old cases with new tools. State and federal funding has been allocated to process previously unanalyzed evidence. And case by case, one by one, those efforts have produced results. A match comes back from a database. A name emerges from a profile that has been sitting in storage for a decade or two. A detective makes an arrest. A family gets an answer. It is slow work. It is methodical work. It is the opposite of the dramatic, rapid-fire investigation that television procedurals would have us believe is normal. Real cold case work is patient and painstaking and often unrewarding for long stretches before a breakthrough arrives. But it works. The Kirsten Hatfield case is proof that it works. And every time it works, the message is the same: it is worth going back. It is worth pulling the file. It is worth sending the evidence to the lab. Because somewhere in that evidence, there may be an answer that a family has been waiting years to receive. There is another dimension to this case that I think deserves some time, and that is the human dimension. Not just the forensics and the investigation and the technology, but the people. Kirsten Hatfield was a child. She was 8 years old. She had a name, a face, a personality, a future that was taken from her on a summer night in Oklahoma. She was not an abstraction. She was not a data point in a case file. She was a little girl who went to a sleepover and never came home. And she had a mother. I keep coming back to the mother in this story, because I think she represents something that is easy to overlook when we focus on the investigative and forensic elements of a case. She represents the human cost of a cold case that goes unresolved. The years and years of living with a question that has no answer. The way that kind of grief reshapes a person. The way it changes how you move through the world, how you relate to time, how you hold on to the possibility of hope while also slowly accepting the reality of loss. For 18 years, Kirsten's mother lived in a particular kind of limbo. Not fully able to grieve, because there was no certainty about what had happened. Not fully able to move on, because how do you move on from something with no ending? Not fully able to hope, because the years kept passing and the answers kept not coming. 18 years. Her daughter would have been 26 years old when the arrest was finally made. A grown woman. Perhaps with her own life, her own story, her own children. Instead, she remained, in her mother's heart and in the official record and in the memory of everyone who knew her, forever 8 years old. That is what was taken. Not just a child's life. But a mother's future with that child. Every year that would have been. Every birthday, every graduation, every ordinary Tuesday that they would have spent together. All of it gone. And then, layered on top of that loss, 18 years of not knowing. 18 years of carrying the weight of an open question. When the arrest finally came, when the DNA match led investigators to the man who had lived 2 doors down, the news would have reached Kirsten's mother with a complexity that is hard to imagine from the outside. There would have been something like relief, perhaps. The relief of finally knowing. The relief of finally being able to point to a person and say, that is who did this. That name, that face, that individual, that is who took my daughter. But the relief, if it came, would have existed alongside grief. Because the answer does not bring Kirsten back. The answer closes one kind of uncertainty and opens the door to a different kind of reckoning. The reckoning with what was lost. The reckoning with 18 years. The reckoning with the fact that the man responsible lived close enough to see the house where his crime took place, and went on with his life, for all of that time. Let me tell you something about the science that made this resolution possible, because I think it is worth understanding on a level beyond the general. Because it is not magic. It is not luck. It is the slow accumulation of scientific knowledge and technological capability applied with patience and care to a set of circumstances where it could finally make a difference. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the molecular blueprint of a living organism. Every human being carries a unique genetic profile, encoded in the DNA present in virtually every cell of their body. When someone touches a surface, when biological material is deposited at a scene, the DNA in that material can potentially be extracted, analyzed, and compared against other profiles. In 1990, when the evidence in Kirsten's case was collected, the ability to do this existed but was limited. The techniques required relatively large samples, took weeks to process, and cost thousands of dollars per analysis. Over the following decades, the science advanced at a remarkable pace. Polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, allowed scientists to amplify tiny amounts of genetic material into quantities large enough to analyze. Short tandem repeat analysis made the process faster and more reliable. Touch DNA techniques made it possible to extract profiles from the traces left by a person simply touching an object. The cost of analysis dropped from thousands of dollars to hundreds. And CODIS, the national database, made it possible to compare a profile extracted from a crime scene against the profiles of millions of individuals who had been convicted of crimes and had their DNA added to the system. This is the chain of science that eventually connected the evidence collected from that windowsill and that blood-stained grass in Midwest City, Oklahoma to the man who lived 2 doors down. The evidence had not degraded beyond usefulness. Properly stored biological evidence can retain analyzable DNA for decades. The material was still there, still intact, still carrying the molecular signature of the person who had been at that window. All it took was someone willing to run the test. And when the test was run, and the profile was built, and that profile was entered into Coldcase, the system did what it was designed to do. It found a match. It returned a name. And an 18-year-old cold case began to move again. The arrest and prosecution of the man identified through DNA evidence brought the case to a conclusion that the legal system was designed to deliver. A name, a match, an arrest, a trial, a verdict. The machinery of justice doing what it was built to do. But I want to sit for a moment in the space between the arrest and the verdict, because that space, the space of a criminal trial, is itself a significant part of the story. When DNA evidence is central to a prosecution, as it was in this case, the defense will often challenge it. Not because the science is necessarily wrong, but because that is the nature of the adversarial legal system. Defense attorneys are obligated to test the prosecution's evidence, to probe for weaknesses, to present alternative interpretations or question the integrity of the chain of custody. In cases where biological evidence has been stored for years or decades, chain of custody questions are particularly significant. Chain of custody refers to the documented record of every person who handled a piece of evidence, every place it was stored, every time it was accessed. A clean chain of custody demonstrates that the evidence has been preserved properly and has not been contaminated or tampered with. A broken or questionable chain of custody can create reasonable doubt about the reliability of a DNA result, even when the science itself is sound. In the Kirsten Hatfield case, the fact that the evidence had been in storage for 18 years would almost certainly have been a point of scrutiny. How had it been stored? What documentation existed showing its condition and its location through those years? Had it been properly sealed against contamination? These are not unreasonable questions. They are the right questions for a legal system founded on the presumption of innocence and the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Whatever challenges were raised, the outcome of the process was a conviction. The evidence held up. The science held up. And the man who had lived 2 doors down from the Hatfield family was held accountable. Justice, in the form that our legal system can deliver, was done. But even as we say that, even as we acknowledge the significance of that outcome, it is worth remembering what justice in this context actually is and is not. It is the formal recognition by a court of law that a specific individual committed a specific crime. It is the imposition of consequences for that crime. It is, for the family, the official acknowledgement that they were right to believe something terrible happened and that someone was responsible. What it is not, what it can never be, is the restoration of what was lost. Kirsten Hatfield remained missing. No amount of legal process would change that. The verdict answered the who and the how in legal terms. It did not answer everything. And that is the reality of this case that I think we have to hold alongside everything else. The resolution is real and it matters enormously. And the loss is also real and it is permanent. Both things are true simultaneously. If you are still with me at this point in the story, I want to stop for just a moment and ask you to do something. Drop a comment right now and type the words "I am still here." That is it. Just those 3 words. Because we are deep into the story of Kirsten Hatfield, and the people who are truly following along, who are sitting with the weight of this case and staying through the difficult parts, those are the people who are keeping this memory alive. So drop that comment. I am still here. Let's see who is truly with us on this one. There is something I want to come back to, something I raised earlier in the story that I do not want to leave behind. The question of how a killer lives 2 doors down from his crime for 18 years. It seems, on its surface, almost incomprehensible. We tend to imagine that guilt announces itself. That a person who has done something monstrous will be visibly marked by it in some way, that neighbors will sense it, that something will seem off, that the weight of what they have done will manifest in behavior that tips someone off. But the research on this, the forensic psychology, the criminology, the case studies of individuals who committed serious violent crimes and went undetected for extended periods, tells a different story. Most people who commit violent crimes against children do not look like the monsters we imagine. They do not have visible markers that distinguish them from anyone else. They are neighbors, co-workers, community members. They attend gatherings. They wave hello from their driveways. They are, from the outside, ordinary. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in criminal psychology. The capacity for terrible acts does not announce itself. It does not carve itself into a person's face or manifest in the way they carry themselves through the world. In many cases, the people most capable of extraordinary violence are also the most capable of presenting an ordinary, unremarkable exterior. In the case of this man, the neighbor who lived 2 doors down, we have to reckon with the fact that he existed in that community for 18 years after the disappearance of Kirsten Hatfield. People saw him, interacted with him, perhaps thought of him as a normal part of the neighborhood, perhaps never gave him a second thought. All while he carried the knowledge of what he had done. All while the biological evidence that would eventually identify him sat in a storage room, untested. There is something almost surreal about that proximity. About the fact that the answers to a mystery that tormented a family for nearly 2 decades were, in a very literal sense, right there. 2 doors down. Walking distance. Within the geography of grief every single day. The community of Midwest City was living with the answer without knowing it. It is worth taking some time now to think about what this case tells us about the broader landscape of cold case investigation in the United States, because the lessons here extend well beyond any single case. First, evidence matters, and evidence preservation matters enormously. The fact that the biological material from Kirsten's case was still usable 18 years later is not a given. It is the result of proper storage procedures being followed at the time of collection and maintained through the years that followed. Biological evidence is perishable under the wrong conditions. Heat, moisture, improper containment can all degrade DNA to the point where analysis becomes impossible. The officers who processed that crime scene in 1990 followed the correct procedures, and because they did, the evidence was there when it was finally needed. This is worth acknowledging. In the story of what went wrong in this case, the years of an untested kit, the delayed analysis, it would be easy to assign blame broadly to everyone involved in the original investigation. But the truth is more nuanced. The evidence was collected properly. The storage was appropriate. The failure was not in the initial handling of the evidence but in the subsequent decision, or absence of decision, to analyze it. Second, cold case units and dedicated cold case investigators are not a luxury. They are a necessity. The detective who eventually reopened Kirsten's file and sent the evidence for analysis was doing the work that cold case investigation requires: patient, methodical, committed work that does not make the news until the breakthrough arrives. Cold case units represent a recognition that the capacity to solve crimes does not end at the statute of limitations for investigation, that old cases deserve ongoing attention, and that advances in technology create ongoing obligations to revisit evidence that was previously unanalyzable. States and municipalities that have invested in cold case investigation infrastructure have seen results. Cases that were filed and forgotten have been reopened. Arrests have been made. Families have gotten answers. The return on that investment, measured in terms of justice delivered and closure provided, is real. Third, the National DNA Database, CODIS, is only as powerful as the data that is in it. The fact that the DNA profile built from Kirsten's evidence produced a match means that the person identified had previously had their DNA added to the database, typically through a prior criminal conviction. Had he never been convicted of anything else, his profile would not have been in the system, and the DNA match would not have returned a name. This is a significant limitation of database-based DNA matching. It relies on the existence of a prior profile. For individuals who have committed serious crimes but have no prior criminal record, the database approach will not produce a match. This is one of the reasons why genetic genealogy, the use of consumer DNA databases to identify relatives of an unknown suspect and work backward to a potential identity, has become an increasingly important tool in cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy does not require a prior profile in a law enforcement database. It requires only that some biological relative of the suspect has submitted DNA to a consumer genealogy service. The use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations has expanded significantly in recent years. It was used to identify the Golden State Killer in California after decades of failed investigation, a case that became a landmark in the field and opened the door to its use in other cold cases across the country. But in the Kirsten Hatfield case, traditional Cody's matching was sufficient. The profile came back. The name appeared. And the door that had been closed for 18 years finally opened. I want to take a moment to address something that often comes up in discussions of cold cases resolved through DNA evidence, and that is the question of what happens to the families in the aftermath of an arrest and conviction. We tend to narrativize justice. We tend to think of it as an endpoint, a moment of resolution after which things improve and healing begins. And in some ways, for some families, an arrest and conviction does bring a measure of relief. The not knowing ends. The question of who is answered. The legal system has made its determination and imposed its consequences. But the reality for families of victims, particularly in cases like this, where the victim was never recovered and the crime occurred against a child, is far more complicated. Grief does not resolve because a verdict comes down. A mother who has spent 18 years without her daughter does not become whole in the courtroom. The wounds that formed over those years, the weight of the not knowing, the way that uncertainty reshapes a person, do not simply close when the legal process concludes. What families often describe is a mixed experience. Relief, yes. But also grief. Fresh grief, in some cases, as the details of the crime emerge through the trial process and make vivid and specific what had previously been only imagined. Anger at the years that were lost. Anger at the system that did not find this answer sooner. And a particular, quiet kind of mourning for the fact that the answer, when it finally came, could not change anything about what had already happened. For Kirsten's mother, the arrest and conviction of the man who took her daughter would have closed the investigative chapter of this story. But Kirsten was still gone. And that would always be true. There is a phrase that comes up in victim advocacy circles, the idea that for families of missing victims, there is a particular kind of double grief. The grief for the person who was lost, and the grief for the possibility of ever having a body to bury. Without a body, without a grave, without a specific physical location where a life ended and can be remembered, the mourning process is necessarily incomplete in ways that are hard for outsiders to fully understand. Kirsten Hatfield's family had been living in that double grief for 18 years by the time the arrest was made. And even after the verdict, that particular dimension of their grief remained. This is part of why we do this. Not just to document the cases. Not just to walk through the forensics and the timelines and the investigative steps. But to hold these stories in a way that honors the people at the center of them. To say the names. To sit with the weight of the loss. To refuse to let the human cost of violent crime be reduced to a case number or a line in a database. Kirsten Hatfield. 8 years old. Midwest City, Oklahoma. 1990. Her name deserves to be spoken. Her story deserves to be known. And the 18 years that her family spent waiting for answers deserves to be understood not as an abstraction or a statistic but as 18 actual years of actual human life shaped by loss and uncertainty and the particular agony of a question that would not be answered. There is another element of this case that I want to explore, and that is the question of prevention. Because one of the things that cases like this raise, cases where a perpetrator went undetected for a long period of time, living in proximity to the community he harmed, is the question of whether warning signs existed that were not recognized or acted upon. In the world of criminal profiling and behavioral analysis, researchers have identified patterns that are common among individuals who commit violent crimes against children. These patterns do not constitute a profile in the sense of a guaranteed predictor. There is no reliable algorithm that can identify a future offender before the fact. But they do represent risk indicators that, in retrospect, can sometimes be seen in the history of an individual who is later identified as a perpetrator. Prior criminal behavior is often one of these indicators. The fact that the DNA database match in Kirsten's case worked, meaning that the man identified had a prior DNA profile in the system, tells us that he had previously been processed through the criminal justice system in a way that required DNA collection. This suggests a prior criminal history, though the details of what that history included are part of the specific case record. Whether that prior history included anything that might have flagged him as a risk to children in his neighborhood, whether there were warning signs that were not connected to the dots that needed to be connected, is a question that the investigation and prosecution would have explored. The broader lesson from this pattern, the lesson that applies beyond any individual case, is about information sharing and community awareness. It is about the systems that are designed to track individuals with histories of violent or predatory behavior and ensure that the communities where they live have the information they need to protect themselves and their children. These systems are imperfect. They have always been imperfect. They will always be imperfect. No system can prevent every crime. No database, no registry, no notification framework can guarantee that a person with violent intent will be identified and stopped before they act. But the existence and improvement of these systems matters. The information they contain matters. And the willingness of communities and law enforcement agencies to take seriously the risk indicators that these systems identify matters enormously. In Kirsten's case, whatever the specifics of the perpetrator's history, the outcome was not prevented. A child was taken from a window in the night. A family was destroyed. A community was left with a wound that 18 years did not fully heal. The prevention conversation is not about assigning blame or suggesting that any single failure was responsible for what happened. It is about learning. About taking what these cases teach us and applying those lessons to the systems and structures that exist to protect children going forward. Because the goal, the ultimate, ongoing, never fully achieved goal, is fewer cases like this one. Fewer families sitting with the weight of a missing child. Fewer detectives staring at a cold case file wondering where to begin. Fewer years of waiting for an answer that the evidence has been holding all along. Let me tell you about the detective in this story. Not by name, we are not going to name names in that direction tonight, but by what they represent. Because in every cold case that is eventually solved, there is a moment when a person decides to try. A moment when someone looks at a file that has been sitting closed and decides to open it again. A moment when someone asks the question that changes everything. In Kirsten's case, that moment came when a detective looked at the evidence log and realized that the biological material collected from the scene had never been submitted for DNA analysis. Think about what it takes to get to that moment. Think about what kind of person arrives at work and picks up a file that has been cold for a decade or two and decides, Today we try again. It requires a specific combination of qualities. Thoroughness, the willingness to read carefully, to check every item on every list, to not assume that because a case is old everything has already been tried. Persistence, the ability to maintain motivation in the face of years of accumulated failure. And something harder to name, a kind of commitment to the idea that these cases matter, that the families at the other end of these files deserve someone who will keep trying. Cold case detectives often describe their work in terms that have a certain philosophical quality. They talk about the families. About the way a face in an old photograph can remind them why the work matters. About the sense of obligation they feel to victims who have no other advocate left in the system. This is not glamorous work. It does not produce results on the timeline of a television procedural. It involves a great deal of paperwork and database searching and quiet waiting for labs to return results. The breakthroughs, when they come, are rarely explosive. They are often quiet, a phone call, an email, a result that comes back from the lab and sits for a moment in the space between the screen and the detective's eyes while the implications settle in. But in those quiet moments, entire families are changed. An entire history is rewritten. An answer that was 18 years in the making finally arrives. That is the work. And the detective who did that work in Kirsten's case, whoever they are, wherever they are, did something that mattered. They did something that no one else had done. And because of that, a case that might have remained cold forever instead found its resolution. The role of the community in a case like this is something that deserves its own consideration, because communities are not passive backdrops to violent crimes. They are living, breathing ecosystems of relationships and knowledge and perception, and they play a significant role in both the experience of a crime and the process of its investigation. Midwest City, Oklahoma in 1990 was a community that experienced something deeply traumatic. A child from within the neighborhood, a child who was spending the night a few houses away from her home, was taken in the night. The response in any close-knit community to this kind of event is a mix of fear, grief, and collective determination to find answers. In the immediate aftermath of Kirsten's disappearance, the community would have rallied in the way that communities do, searching, sharing information, watching their children more closely, locking windows and doors that might previously have been left open on warm summer nights. The investigation would have involved community members as witnesses and sources of information, people who had seen something or heard something or knew something about the neighborhood and its inhabitants. Over time, as the case went cold and the investigation stalled, the community would have processed its grief and fear in the way that communities do, slowly, imperfectly, moving forward in the way that life demands even when questions remain open. New families would have moved onto the street. Children who had been Kirsten's age in 1990 would have grown into adults. The neighborhood would have changed around the space where the crime occurred, the houses repainted and renovated, the streets filled with different faces. And through all of that, the man 2 doors down. The perpetrator living in proximity to the community that had been affected by his actions is not unique to this case. It is actually a pattern that comes up in multiple cold case investigations, perpetrators who remain embedded in the communities where they committed crimes, who participate in the public grieving process, who may have attended vigils or expressed sympathy to victims' families, all while carrying the private knowledge of what they had done. The psychology of this is something that researchers in criminal behavior have explored extensively. The ability to compartmentalize, to maintain a functional social exterior while carrying knowledge of serious violent crime, is a characteristic that appears repeatedly in profiles of individuals who commit premeditated offenses and go undetected for extended periods. It is not something that feels intuitive to most of us. It feels impossible. How do you look a grieving mother in the eye knowing what you know? How do you go about the ordinary business of a day, buying groceries, making small talk, waving hello to a neighbor, with that weight inside you? The answer, from what research and case studies tell us, is that for some individuals, that weight does not function the way we would expect it to. The moral architecture that most people carry, the structure of conscience and empathy and guilt that would make such compartmentalization impossible, is simply different in people who commit these crimes. Not absent necessarily, but fundamentally altered. This is not an attempt to explain away or rationalize what happened. It is an attempt to understand how something that seems impossible, a perpetrator living quietly in the community for 18 years, becomes possible in practice. I want to spend some time now on something that I think is fundamentally important to understanding this case in its full context, and that is the question of what we owe to victims of violent crime even after the legal process has concluded. We tend, as a society, to measure justice by its legal outcomes. Arrest. Conviction. Sentence. These are the milestones that mark the formal resolution of a criminal case. And they matter. They matter enormously. They represent the state's acknowledgement that a crime occurred, that a specific individual is responsible, and that consequences will follow. But the families of violent crime victims often find that the end of the legal process is not the end of their experience with the aftermath of what happened to them. They continue to live with loss. They continue to live with grief. And they often find that once the legal system has concluded its work, the broader support structures, the attention, the advocacy, the resources, tend to fall away. This is a systemic issue in how we as a society support the families of violent crime victims. The intensity of focus that surrounds an active investigation, a trial, a verdict, does not persist in the same way through the years of living that come after. And for families dealing with the specific trauma of a missing child, a situation in which, as in Kirsten's case, the victim's remains were never found, the ongoing nature of the loss is particularly acute. Victim advocacy organizations work to address this gap. They provide ongoing support and resources to families navigating the long aftermath of violent crime. They push for policy changes that better serve the needs of families who are left behind after the cameras move on and the legal process concludes. They work to keep these cases in public awareness, to ensure that missing individuals are not forgotten, and to advocate for the resources needed to continue investigating unresolved aspects of closed cases. The question of Kirsten's remains, the fact that she was never found, represents an open thread in a case that is otherwise legally resolved. A conviction exists, but a full accounting does not. And for families in this situation, the advocacy work continues even after the verdict. The push to learn everything that can be learned. The push to bring a loved one home, even if home means only a place of rest, a grave, a specific location where grief can be directed. This is part of the ongoing reality of violent crimes' aftermath. And it is part of why the work of cold case investigation matters not just at the point of resolution but in every year that follows. There is a dimension of this story that I have not yet fully addressed, and that is the impact of a case like this on the investigators who work it. Cold case investigation is among the most psychologically demanding work in law enforcement. The nature of the cases, often involving children, often involving the worst that human beings do to one another, always involving families who have been waiting for years or decades for answers, places an extraordinary emotional and psychological burden on the people who take them on. Detectives who work cold cases describe a particular kind of relationship with the cases they carry. It is professional, yes, methodical and evidence-based and guided by the protocols and procedures of law enforcement. But it is also, inevitably, personal. You spend hours in the company of a victim's photograph, a family's grief, a crime scene frozen in documentation from years or decades past. You carry these cases in a way that goes beyond the professional. The breakthrough, when it comes, brings its own complex emotional landscape. The satisfaction of a resolution, of an answer finally delivered, is real. But so is the exhaustion of the years it took to get there. And so, often, is the grief of what was lost along the way. The detective who solved Kirsten's case brought justice to a family after 18 years of waiting. But they also came face to face with 18 years of what that waiting had cost. Law enforcement agencies have become increasingly aware of the psychological toll that violent crime investigation, and cold case investigation in particular, takes on the people who do it. Support structures, counseling resources, peer support programs have been developed and expanded in many departments. The conversation about investigator wellness, which for years was largely absent from the professional culture of law enforcement, has become more present and more serious. This is not unrelated to the quality of the work. Investigators who are supported, who have access to resources that help them process the psychological weight of what they encounter, are better equipped to do the sustained, patient work that cold case investigation requires. Burnout and compassion fatigue are real risks in this field, and they have real consequences for case outcomes. The detective who reopened Kirsten's case and pushed through to a resolution did something that required not just professional skill but personal resilience. The capacity to engage with an 18-year-old tragedy, to carry the weight of it, and to keep working until there was somewhere new to go with it, that is a form of dedication that deserves acknowledgement alongside the technical accomplishments of the investigation. Now I want to draw together some of the threads that we have been following through this story, because I think it is worth sitting with the full picture before we get to the end. Kirsten Hatfield disappeared in 1990 from a bedroom in Midwest City, Oklahoma. She was 8 years old. The evidence at the scene told a story of violence. She was never found. The investigation stalled. The evidence sat untested. The case went cold. For 18 years, the man responsible lived 2 doors away. And then a detective asked a question. And the question led to a lab. And the lab returned a name. And the name led to an arrest. And the evidence held up in court. And a verdict came down. That is the arc of the story in its simplest form. But embedded in that arc are all of the dimensions we have explored tonight. The science of DNA analysis and how it advanced from an early, expensive technology to a routine investigative tool. The systemic failure of evidence backlogs and what they mean for the families on the other side of cold case files. The psychology of perpetrators who commit violent acts and go on living ordinary lives in ordinary communities. The sustained grief of families waiting years for answers. The work of cold case investigators who carry these cases with them. The limits of what justice can restore. All of these dimensions are real. All of them are part of the story. And all of them matter to a complete understanding of what happened to Kirsten Hatfield and what her case means beyond the specific details of her specific situation. Because individual cases carry lessons. The reason we tell these stories, the reason cold case investigation matters as a field and true crime as a genre has the audience it has, is that we are drawn to these stories not just out of morbid curiosity but out of a genuine human need to understand. To understand how these things happen. To understand how they are resolved or not resolved. To understand what they say about the systems and the people and the values that shape our society. And what Kirsten's case says, what it has to say clearly and loudly and in a way that should not be ignored, is this: the evidence to solve a crime may be sitting right there, waiting. Waiting for someone to look. Waiting for someone to send it to a lab. Waiting for someone to refuse to let a cold case stay cold. And the families at the other end of those cold cases are waiting too. Waiting the way Kirsten's mother waited for 18 years. With diminishing hope but undiminished love. With the kind of patience that is not really patience at all but simply the only option available when there are no other options. Those families deserve someone who looks. They deserve someone who sends the evidence to the lab. They deserve a detective who opens the file and asks the question. And in Kirsten's case, eventually, they got one. The aftermath of the conviction in this case would have brought a particular kind of reckoning, not just for the perpetrator and for the family, but for the community of Midwest City and for the investigators and the system that was involved over those 18 years. In the court of public opinion, which runs alongside the legal system without being bound by its rules, the question of accountability tends to be broader than any single individual. When a case sits unresolved for 18 years and the answer turns out to have been available, when evidence sits untested while a family waits, the natural human response is to ask who is responsible for that delay. The answer, honestly, is complicated. In 1990, the forensic capability to easily analyze the evidence did not yet exist in the form that eventually resolved the case. The investigators working the case at the time were not refusing to use tools they had. They were working with the tools available to them. But as the years progressed and the technology advanced, as DNA analysis became routine, as CODIs became operational and populated with profiles, as the cost of analysis dropped and the capability of forensic labs expanded, the question shifts. At some point in the late 1990s or the 2000s, the evidence in Kirsten's case could have been analyzed. The technology was there. The database was there. Why didn't it happen sooner? That question does not have a single answer. It involves resource allocation, departmental priorities, case management systems, and the specific human decisions made or not made by the individuals responsible for the cases in their jurisdiction. It involves systemic issues in how cold cases are managed and how evidence is tracked and how the transition from a hot case to a cold case to a reopened case is navigated administratively. There is no villain in this part of the story, or rather, the true villain is the systemic inadequacy itself. The absence of robust mandatory protocols for revisiting cold case evidence as technology advances. The funding gaps that leave evidence backlogs unaddressed for years. The case management systems that do not automatically flag old evidence for reconsideration when new analytical capabilities become available. These are structural problems. And they have structural solutions. Solutions that advocacy organizations, policymakers, forensic scientists, and law enforcement leaders have been working toward, with incremental but real success, over the years since cases like Kirsten's have come to light and demonstrated the cost of delay. As we move toward the end of this story, I want to spend some time with the broader community of people who care about cases like Kirsten's. Because you are part of that community. The people watching this video, following this channel, staying with this story through more than an hour of detail and nuance and difficult truth, you are part of something that matters. Cold case awareness is not just entertainment. It is not just a genre. For many people who engage with this content deeply and seriously, it is a form of advocacy. It is a way of keeping the names of victims alive. It is a way of maintaining pressure on the systems that are responsible for delivering justice, of saying with our attention and our engagement, we see these cases. We remember these people. We are not willing to let them be forgotten. There is real evidence that public attention to cold cases has investigative value. Tips that come in years after a crime are often generated by media coverage or documentary content that brings a case back to public attention. Witnesses who were reluctant to come forward at the time of the original investigation are sometimes moved to do so when they encounter a case again years later and realize the importance of what they know. The simple act of keeping a case in public consciousness can be the difference between an answer and continued silence. You, watching this tonight, are part of that. And that matters. For the families of victims, knowing that people outside their immediate circle still remember and still care is itself meaningful. In a world where attention is scarce and the news cycle moves fast, the persistence of engagement with a case like Kirsten's is a form of solidarity. It is a way of saying, we have not moved on. We have not forgotten. This person was real and her story matters. There is one more dimension of this case that I want to address before we bring this story to its close, and that is the question of what Kirsten's case has meant for the evolution of cold case practice and forensic policy in the years since it was resolved. Cases that demonstrate both the failure of systems and the power of the science that eventually corrects those failures tend to become reference points in policy discussions. They become the stories that advocates cite when arguing for dedicated cold case funding. They become the cases that forensic scientists point to when making the argument for mandatory evidence review protocols. They become the examples that appear in law enforcement training programs to illustrate what is at stake when evidence sits unanalyzed. We do not know with certainty the specific policy impact of the Kirsten Hatfield case. But we know the pattern. Cases like this one inform the practice. They change how departments approach their cold case backlogs. They create urgency around the question of what is sitting in storage rooms that has never been tested and what answers might be waiting there. Every solved cold case is an argument for doing the work of solving cold cases. Every family that finally gets an answer because someone reopened a file is evidence that the work is worth doing. Every conviction secured through DNA analysis of evidence collected decades earlier is a demonstration that the investment in forensic capability and cold case investigative capacity pays off in justice. And every case that remains open, every file that is still waiting for someone to ask the right question, is a reminder that the work is not done. There are families right now, tonight, who are where Kirsten's family was for 18 years. Living with the not knowing. Waiting for the question to be asked. Waiting for the evidence to be sent to the lab. Waiting for the name that will make the waiting finally mean something. Those families deserve the same determination that eventually found its way to Kirsten's case. They deserve someone who opens the file. They deserve a question asked. They deserve an answer. Kirsten Hatfield. 8 years old. Midwest City, Oklahoma. 1990. The window was unlocked. The blood was on the sill. The torn underwear lay in the grass soaked through with what no child's clothing should ever be soaked through with. And the little girl was gone. For 18 years, the answer lived 2 doors down. And then a detective asked a question. And science did what science does when given the chance, it told the truth. The truth that had been waiting, preserved in biological material, stored in a room, through all of those years of a family's grief and a community's not knowing and a perpetrator's quiet, walking, breathing freedom. The truth came out. And the case that had gone cold, that had sat in storage, that had represented for years the gap between what justice could be and what it actually was, that case moved. It moved toward resolution. It moved toward accountability. It moved, in the limited but real way that justice can move, toward something that looked like an answer. And for Kirsten's mother, who had spent 18 years waking up every morning to the weight of a question with no answer, that answer, however incomplete, however unable to restore what was lost, was something. It was a name. It was a face. It was someone who could be held responsible. It was, in the specific and bounded way that our systems can deliver, justice. And Kirsten Hatfield, 8 years old, forever 8 years old, deserved every bit of it. This has been Coldcase Crimelab. Thank you for staying with this story through every chapter of it. Cases like Kirsten's are the reason this channel exists, because these stories matter, because these names deserve to be spoken, because cold cases deserve the sustained attention and the serious forensic examination that can sometimes, with time and determination and the advancing power of science, turn silence into answers. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of it, if you found yourself thinking about Kirsten and her family and the years of waiting and the eventual resolution, then please take a moment right now and do something for us. Like this video. Hit that button. It tells the algorithm that this content matters and it helps us reach more people who deserve to hear these stories. Leave a comment. Tell us what you took from this case. Tell us what it made you think about or feel. Tell us if you knew about this case before tonight or if you are hearing it for the first time. Tell us the part that hit you hardest. We read every single comment on this channel. Every one. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you have not already. We put out new content every week, deep dives, forensic breakdowns, full case histories, and we never want you to miss an episode. There are so many more stories to tell. So many more families who deserve to have their cases examined this carefully. And we are going to keep doing this work as long as you are here with us. One more thing. Share this video. Share it with someone who you think needs to hear Kirsten's name. Share it on your social media. Send it to a friend who cares about cold cases or forensic science or justice or simply about the truth. Because every share puts this story in front of someone new. And every someone new who hears Kirsten's name is one more person keeping her memory alive. That is how we honor victims. By refusing to let them be forgotten. By saying their names. By staying, all the way to the end. Kirsten Hatfield. We say your name. We have not forgotten. This has been Coldcase Crimelab. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions. Because the questions are sometimes all that's standing between the cold and the truth. Good night.